It's Tuesday, July 1st, Canada Day, and this is Don't Forget to FOSS, the weekly podcast about free and open source software projects and community. I'm Robin Monks. Let's dig in. The first FOSS project this week is Hollo, a tiny Mastodon API-compatible Fediverse server. If you're someone who wants to host your own Mastodon instance just for you, you've probably found that installing the entire Mastodon server is large and isn't really designed for a single user. It's made for communities with moderators, hot topics, a community landing page, and a heavy amount of setup and resources to allow it to scale. Hollo takes a different approach. It's designed for a single individual or business user and removes a lot of the complexity. It's compliant with the Mastodon API, so you can use your favorite Mastodon app, and it doesn't provide its own editor front end. So you can use your own favorite Mastodon app. For me, that would be Ivory. There's lots of good ones like Ice Cubes out there. It also requires fewer resources and configuration to get running. The project site has a one-button deploy option, but also has a Docker Compose file that I've been playing with. Currently, I have a full Mastodon install for my monks.city instance. I might move monks.city over to this at some point because as much as I really love Masto hosts, and they've been absolutely amazing for me, Mastodon itself isn't really designed well for a single user on a single site, and I think Hollo will work better for me. I'll follow up if I do make that transition in the future. Personally, a single file Mastodon API compatible tool would be a dream solution. I'd love to see a Golang drop in and run tiny application that uses an SQLite file for its database, has a set file directory for storing images, and has all its config in a single YAML or ini file. Hollo still needs a Postgres and S3 compatible store. Docker makes doing that easy, especially with Minio, and Hollo is pretty easy right now, and I will probably settle for Hollo as the best option, but I can't help but feel there's still one more level of simplification possible. Sources for Hollo are going to be in the show notes. The second FOSS project this week is Lunar, an advanced brightness manager for macOS that can leverage the XDR display in Macs to go brighter than the default, dimmer than the default, and can control multiple attached monitors to keep them all at the same visible brightness. The project is supported with additional pro features that aren't open source, and I'm generally supportive of FOSS project owners finding ways to support themselves and their work, so that's not a deal breaker for me, and I've personally paid for a pro license. There's often friction in the community around if a project has some paid non-FOSS features, if that project as a whole would still qualify as FOSS. I'm a practical person. I really want the people who make the tools and software I use to be able to support themselves and their families. I want them to be able to provide and enjoy providing their project to the world. I especially give a wide amount of flexibility when it's an individual or a small company versus a large firm. I'd rather have most of a project be free and open source software than push someone away into fully closing their software. Sources for Lunar are in the show notes. I recommend giving it a try if you are a Mac user. It makes your life so much easier, especially if you have external monitors. Lyon, the second largest metro area in France, that's roughly the size of Portland, Oregon, or Brisbane, Australia, has decided to seek out digital sovereignty and ditch big tech. Following in the footsteps of Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany, they've decided to transition away from Microsoft 365 for their government employees with the Latvia-based OnlyOffice, developed by Ascensio Systems. I'd never heard of OnlyOffice before, so decided to check it out. The public-facing website is very focused on selling their hosted solution, but follow the GitHub link in the footer and you'll find their AGPL v3 license source code. You can self-host their collaboration server yourself, and if you don't need real-time collaboration, you can download their desktop apps directly for Linux, Mac, or Windows, and they need no server to run. I tested it out on my macOS main driver, and the suite is obviously going for being as close to the ribbon layout as possible to Microsoft Office. They're trying to avoid any need to relearn how to use the software for those familiar with Microsoft Office. It was snappy. I opened up a whole bunch of Word, PowerPoint, and Excel docs to test out its compatibility, and it did a really good job. It was not 100% perfect, but any differences in rendering were minor and mostly affected presentations. Ultimately, if LibreOffice isn't close enough to Microsoft Office for you, OnlyOffice is probably worth trying. I can also see it being useful for older family members who don't want to relearn a different UI. It also operates kind of like LibreOffice does on macOS, where all the different applications for word processing, spreadsheets, presentations, all that stuff, they're all in a single container app. So you don't launch like only Office presentations or only Office documents. You launch only Office, and then inside that, all those different styles of documents, and they're in the same application. I'm not a big fan of that layout. I quite like having a document and a spreadsheet as totally separate applications. It makes tabbing more natural for me between them, but it's not a deal breaker. It reminds me a lot of the old days with the Microsoft Works for those who are technology ancient like me. If you remember Microsoft Works 4.0, give me a shout. It's interesting that Lyon is framing this primarily as a digital sovereignty issue, wanting to not rely on US-based tech companies as tensions flare during tariff discussions, and American tech companies are increasingly raising prices and collecting data to train and push their AI models. I'm happy to see they also saw open source as a key component to being able to truly own their data and workflow. Because OnlyOffice is an open platform, they can change implementation and maintenance vendors at will or maintain their own hosted instance themselves if they decide to in-house that knowledge. Denmark's Ministry for Digitization also announced a transition to open source as a key part of sovereignty. In their case, they've opted to move to LibreOffice. Minister Caroline Olsen plans to fully transition by the end of this year. One thing I like to see as part of the argument for this transition is that moving to open source operating systems and applications will allow hardware purchases to function well for longer. This is absolutely true, as Linux traditionally will run securely and happily in hardware long after Microsoft and Apple have abandoned support. Incumbent vendors will try to highlight training and switching costs as a reason to not move to open source, but getting more years out of existing hardware can more than make up that cost difference. The forced transition to Windows 11 this year also has gotten companies looking at the cost to replace versus the cost to switch. At this point, there's not much of a downside. Sources and links for the story can be found in the show notes. A lot of the links go over to the Register, which has been doing a great job reporting on this. Meanwhile, famous YouTuber PewDiePie has moved to Arch Linux for his OS after saying he was being tortured by Windows a few months ago. Since then, he's followed up with a second video encouraging even more switches to open source tools, including finding a better browser, installing Graphene OS on his Pixel hardware phone, and the note-taking app Joplin. His video was trending at number 17 on YouTube with close to 4 million views when I checked it out, and it shows a lot of people are being exposed to the ideals behind free and open source software. For PewDiePie, his goal is to stop giving money and data to big tech. In the video, he shows how he was able to run some self-hosted tools on his Steam Deck. Because the Steam Deck also runs Arch Linux, there was an easy transition for him to make and be able to try out some things pretty quickly. Probably not a great long-term solution, but was interesting to see and interesting to show how you can use what you already have on hand as a way to get started in open source software. The desire to avoid AI, the cost increases big tech is trying to push on consumers, and the privacy invasion from major platforms is draining a new wave of interest in open source software and open source principles I've personally not seen since the first green shoots started to appear after the dot-com bubble burst torched the first wave of internet companies in the early aughts. Even though we've not seen a similar bubble burst, the enshittification effect is causing a similar desire to get away from closed platforms. Thank you all for the amazing support I've received after launching the first episode. I'm happy to see folks are enjoying the show. For me, making this sustainably is important. And so each week I'm increasing the level of effort and scale a tiny bit. For right now, I'm targeting a 10-minute show as easy since I can research and record it over the weekend. I'd like to grow to the place where I can get the show a little longer and maybe also have some interviews to go along with the topics I'm sharing. But I'm not going to extend to that until I'm sure I can keep the pace going. If you have comments or suggestions, there's lots of options for contacting me over at rpm.sh. The music for the show is by Bodan Kozman. Don't Forget to FOSS is released under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 International License. See you next week. Digital sovereignty. Sovereignty? Sovereignty. Sovereignty? Sovereignty. 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 There we go.